Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Simon Hauger. Simon is an engineer turned high school math and science teacher with 25 plus years of experience in urban education. Simon developed a passion for experiential, problem-based learning early in his career. He started the West Philly Hybrid X team, where his students designed and built award-winning hybrid and electric-powered vehicles. In 2012 and again 2014, Simon and his students were honored by President Obama at the White House. In 2012, Simon and a few of his colleagues launched the Workshop School, a public high school located in West Philadelphia. The Workshop School challenges students to solve real-world problems and organizes teaching and learning in service of doing so. As principal of the school, Simon collaboratively led a team of educators in the design and implementation of a new school model. The school continues to be a powerful example of what students and adults are capable of when they are trusted, challenged, and equipped to do meaningful work. Simon continues to support the Workshop School as he and his colleagues look to take this model of education into post-secondary education. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Simon Hauger. Simon is the co-founder of the Workshop School. Simon, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're really happy to have you. We've been looking forward to this. We've been watching a lot of videos on the Workshop School and all the cool projects you have done. So please tell us about yourself and your background.
Sure. So super quickly, I graduated in electrical engineering and quickly found that that was not my passion. While I enjoyed it as a young adult, I realized that I felt called to do something else. And so I became a math and science teacher in Philadelphia and spent 14 years in the classroom and doing some administrative work connected to that. And during that time, I started an after school program. I was very dissatisfied with the long-term outcomes. I was a great classroom teacher, and yet I wasn't seeing the impact Pythagorean theorem was having on my children 4 years after graduation. And so created this after school program. We kind of just happened to fall into building hybrid and electric cars before they were a thing, and got a lot of notoriety for it. And in that after school space, I found, accidentally discovered what good education could look like when students are trusted and challenged to solve real problems, and their work is showcased. So when the work is authentic and challenging and people believe in you and wrap resources around you, kids can do amazing stuff. And so for me and a few of my colleagues, that was kind of the seed of, we need to start a school that's more about that, trusting young people in their minds and challenging them to solve real problems, and less about, here's some content and we're going to squeeze it into your brain and you're going to give it back to us on some kind of test. And so that was the genesis of the Workshop School. It took us several years to get it started, and it is a public high school in Philadelphia. We decided to work with the district. We felt like the school district of Philadelphia was poised for innovation much more than any other sector. The charter school movement in Philadelphia had fallen quite short of its promise. And we wanted to serve young people that didn't have access to education like this.
Well, I love it so much, and I wish I had a similar type of education when I was in high school. Um, so, I mean, to talk on that, I mean, I'm an educator today, but I don't necessarily know the history of how today's like educational system came about, and I can take a guess that we did not start learning things by the way that it's designed today, right? And this system was built over time, but it also stuck far longer, I feel like, than any other field, right? Like today, I mean, yes, like healthcare is also like expensive, but at least we see like how we were getting surgeries like 10 years ago or 20 years ago looks very different from today, right? There's a clear like growth and innovation and exponential like variety of all sorts of like treatments. And but in education, I feel like, I could go into a classroom 20 or even 100 years ago. The setup could be very similar, except now instead of like, a blackboard, or maybe I don't even remember what they were called, these like transparent things that project, we we have like laptops. So like technology developed, but not necessarily in the field of education. It's just other things, accessories came into, but the setup is still same.
Right.
And it is probably the only field also that can get away with so much lack of innovation. Like, I don't know how this happened.
Yeah.
So I would love to get your thoughts on all of these. Like, how did we even like create this system, and how did it stick so well?
Whew, that's a really hard question. So I totally agree. There's been so many advances in so many different fields. I mean, in the field of design, like think about what design looked like 100 years ago, right? And think about all the innovations that occurred in that field. And you're 100% correct. We have this outdated approach, and stuck it into technology. So the fact that you have crappy content and you digitize it doesn't change the fact that it's still crappy content. It's just now on a computer. So, and some educators think that that's innovative. So, it's a super complicated question. And I mean, I have some thoughts on it. I don't know the exact answer. I think that change is difficult. I read, if your grandfather planted soybeans, your father's going to plant soybeans, you're probably going to be a soybean farmer, right? Like, there's something that for the people that are in power that make these decisions, the broken education system work for them in some way. Um, and uh, and the other thing that's interesting about free market or industry, so if your design firm used the same principles from 100 years ago, you would be bankrupt pretty quickly, right? There's a market force that demands that companies, that industry innovates. If they don't, they go out of business. Education is not held accountable to a bottom line. So what we're ultimately held accountable for is whatever testing is seen as important. And so it's a real challenge to innovate when you're testing things that are outdated. And so there's been multitude of studies that standardized tests, the SATs, they're not predictive of future success, yet we keep using them, right? Like the data is overwhelming at this point. And as the technology's gotten better around data science, school districts buy these big data programs. And so now principals are becoming fake data scientists, and we are looking at all this data thinking that we're making great decisions for kids, but we're still given the wrong set of tools, the wrong set of inputs, right? So we're looking at data around standardized test data, which again has been shown that there's no correlation to future success, or very little, and making decisions with a very limited amount of data. And again, some people think that that's innovative. And so the short answer, it's more complicated than this, but one of the big drivers is the assessment. What is the final assessment? What's the bottom line? And we've pushed on that conversation quite a bit at Workshop School. There's a lot of good research out there. One of my favorite bodies of research is called the My Ways. It was a Gates-funded project, maybe 10 years ago. And some really smart people looked at all the studies, all the prominent studies on what are the skills that are required to be successful. Like, what are the skills we use as adults to be successful? Most of us are not using Pythagorean theorem on a regular basis, or fill in the blank. Like, there's so much content that schools are obsessed with. And again, it comes back to the testing. Like, this content we're obsessed with is because this is the stuff we're being tested on and being held accountable for. And if that correlated to future success, especially for underserved populations, then we would have a moral obligation to teach that stuff. But it doesn't. So why are we still stuck on it? So anyway, you can tell that I'm passionate about that question. It's a complicated question. I could go on and on and on, but that's the assessments need to change is the short answer.
Yeah, but it's almost like I'm hearing we're designing the system to better work for assessments because
Yes.
like assessing something very custom and highly like project based, like maybe it's just more admin work. It's more difficult for so many people. So like just so that we could standardize and manage it at scale, we're foregoing our entire lives upbringing and like and how we learn things like I mean it must be that like we see
Yes.
standardization in all many other different like industries and fields just because it's about like being able to manage something at scale and certain amount of funds, I guess.
Absolutely. That you're exactly right. And change is difficult, right? And education systems are risk averse. When you start to put young children's minds in the mix, there's a lot of emotion and then politics that follow that. And so experimenting in that space is not the same as experimenting in a design space, right? And so there's been a real reluctance to change. And yeah, and change has to happen. Like the world has changed.
Yeah.
And the research is clear. Like if you put a smart group of adults in a room and say, what are the most important skills to be successful? We'll all come up with very similar things. We might use slightly different words, but we're all going to come up with a handful of things. And then if you back into the research, like I was mentioning, the my ways, you can see like, oh yeah, this is the stuff that we use, like collaboration, for example. We'll all come up with some version of collaboration. Collaboration is essential in this day and age. How does schools teach collaboration? A traditional school teaches collaboration by giving you a lecture on collaboration, you doing a worksheet on collaboration, and at the end of the week, you'll take a quiz or a test on collaboration. That's not how, right? Like, and so you're right. Administratively, that's much easier to control, especially at scale. But um, but that's not how you teach collaboration, and it's definitely not how you assess collaboration. Um, and so there are lots of smart educators that have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and there's some really good tools out there um, around doing more authentic work. And that's at the workshop school. That's what we're after. It's definitely messier, but it's not impossible. You get very clear on what are the skills that you want to teach. You get clear about what do those skills look like. So what does collaboration look like on a ninth grade level or a high school level or a teenage level? And then you tie that to evidence in the work. And this is one of the beauties of technology. Now there's software out there that instead of like having to have English class, you can actually track that work and it can roll up into a collaboration grade, or when students are doing writing and research, into the English grade. Like all of our work, I think this is probably true of every sector to some degree, is interdisciplinary. And school is the one place where we're not interdisciplinary, right? And so anyway, project-based, experiential-based, interdisciplinary work, real work, authentic work is at least in my belief the best medium for teaching real skills to young people.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right on just like reluctance to change and how much time it takes. Because like if this was solely a funding issue, right, then all the schools, like high schools, colleges with a lot of money would have already have changed that, right? But we still see something like very similar there. And it's funny because like, for example, in early childhood, there are also a lot of movements like Waldorf, Montessori, and they're
Mhm.
talked about as if they're like these new progressive schools where they're like almost at this point like ancient theories, right? Like they're very well rooted. So somewhere along the way, I guess like throughout the industrial revolution, we just were like, okay, like let's just standardize education and scale it too. And we missed all of the things that we intuitively know what works, right? Like all of us going through education ourselves remember specific classes maybe over others because of maybe an activity there or a project there,
Right.
or if you were very lucky, an educator who really wanted to approach differently. Um, and it shouldn't be by luck, right? Like it shouldn't be like, oh, if I like come across a teacher that understands this difference, I will have a better education. It should really just be part of the system. But then it takes schools like you to really push for it and set case examples of success too, so that other others feel more inclined to change, because I
Right.
think it's an area that is very reluctant of prototyping and progress, right? So I feel like there's going to be immediate search for like successful benchmarks if any change is going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're pushing on our work is to, and it's not just us. There's a national movement around what's authentic assessment look like, and so one of the big challenges is that the post-secondary system is still looking for a lot of traditional metrics. And then after the post-secondary system, the way that success is usually measured is by income level. And so there's a lot of interesting work that's happening in the social science side around flourishing. What does it mean to pursue a life that has purpose, that you're flourishing? I know we all know plenty of people that are financially successful and are not, we wouldn't want their life. Uh, and the corollary to that is a lot of the young people that come from challenging and marginalized communities, like the ones that we serve, the trajectory to get to that level of income is extraordinarily difficult. And yet there's having a life where you have agency, you have power over the decisions that you make, and be able to support yourself and pursue the life that you want. That's what we want for all young people. And that's difficult to measure, right? Again, it comes back to your point from
Yeah.
earlier. When you look at scale, like what are the easy things to measure, often can dictate, well, let's measure that then. So yeah.
Yeah. Hence my eternal debate on like quantitative versus qualitative research. Like maybe the methods we're using should change instead of obsessing about what we're measuring. Um, I want to ask on, obviously, we did say like even if there was great funding for all of this, things wouldn't change tomorrow. But how do you see funding could play an effective role in the way that we need to change, right? Because partially like the reason why we're creating standardization around all of this is to make things more efficient and cost efficient. So how do you see actually technology working for education, right? In this sense, like this does not necessarily have to be a highly expensive solution to be able to have this educational approach. Like how do you see funding could support this but doesn't solely also rely on it?
That's a really good question. I think that I have a particular opinion on this. I don't know if it's right or not, but I'm old enough to know that strong opinions doesn't mean that it's a right opinion.
Mm.
When I was younger, I got that confused. Um, and so and so I'm a huge believer in assessment. Like the more time I've spent in this field, the more I think that ultimately assessment drives instruction, drives the educational model. And I've seen not only our work, but a lot of other progressive educators where there's this tractor field, like trying to pull us back to the center of what's going on. And so if you're being held accountable for some crazy amount of content in biology or algebra 2, which none of us use on a regular basis unless you become specialized in that field, um, it just absorbs a lot of time and energy from what you can do in the school day. And so, and there's a whole bunch of explicit and implicit messages around what intelligence means then, right? So if you're not great at those things, then you're definitely getting implicit messages and sometimes explicit messages that you're just not as smart as the rest of us. Um, and so, I mean, that's a whole different slice of this conversation. That intelligence, actually, I'm sorry, I'm not answering the question directly, but it does touch on a super important point that you mentioned earlier. Standardization wants things to look one way, and intelligence doesn't look one way. And so when you create a model of schools, the current model works for a certain type of learner. It's that type of learner is definitely in the minority. And many of us fake our way into that group just so that we can move through the system and feel good about ourselves. Like, hey, I can be smart. I can give these folks what they want. There's a story that's told, I should remember her name, about a young girl whose teachers can't control her. She's like in first grade or something. Her parents, thankfully, are smart enough that they want to put her on Ritalin. She's super hyperactive. She can't focus. They take her to a psychologist, and they're like, "We're so worried the teachers can't control her." And he said, "Just step outside my office with me for a moment." And they leave the young girl in the office, and he has windows, and she gets up and starts dancing around. And he said, "She's not hyperactive. She's a dancer. Don't drug her. Like,
No.
play to her gifts." She becomes the choreographer for Cats, the musical. So
Oh my
you know
God.
the that's the her parents had enough agency to figure that out, right? Um, and so intelligence looks like a lot of different things, and we all, I have a fundamental belief that we all have gifts and talents, and that school should help young people get in touch with that and not feel bad about um, the places that they're not passionate or strong, right? I happen to be good at math and science, so I was told I was smart. If the world was run by artists, I would have had the biggest IEP ever. Like, I'm terrible at art, and so that doesn't, it's a different intelligence. And so all that to get back to assessment is really important.
Yeah.
So if I had a magic wand or a ton of money, I would create two types of assessments. I would create an assessment for post college.
Mm.
What does it mean to flourish as a young adult? And instead of using just income, uh, what is it to have connection and security and purpose? Like, to us, those are the big three things. And you can call them different things, but when you kind of unpack it, like, I think most folks would agree, like, if you have those three things, if you're in relationships that matter, if you're able to provide for yourself, and if you feel like you're doing work that's meaningful, you're living a fulfilling adult life. And so how do we capture that data so that now schools are trying to get young adults prepared for that? Um, and similarly on the high school level, coming up with assessments around skills that really matter, right? So yes, reading and writing and arithmetic matter. I was an engineer. Algebra 2 doesn't really matter in modern society unless you want to become an engineer. Then go study Algebra 2, right?
Yeah.
I would like young people to be able to look at data and make sense of evidence. And like, there's some fundamental math that's important to be able to navigate society, but are, the standards that, as you said, were set 100 years ago by some old white guy sitting in a room saying everybody needs to learn algebra 2 and chemistry. I'm not sure that's true anymore, right?
Yeah.
So
But I think, I mean, what you're saying also through like for how the system is set up and all these like mechanisms within the system, you said something that made me think something on them very much individual level too, right? Like you said, I'm old enough to know that what I'm saying is maybe not the right thing. I don't know if this is a common approach though as an educator, right? Like I don't think we, like the example you gave of this child, she knew what she wanted to be at that age, right? Like she already felt it. And it's more about having adults around because we do need guidance and assessment, to your point, to be able to recognize that and then guide accordingly, right? But I feel like there's a very, like we don't necessarily trust kids or that and things that they feel about themselves and what they want to learn or what they should learn, right? We there it's a very much dictator approach actually. We have like,
yeah,
you need to learn this, you need to do this, you need to get good at this without hearing anybody. Um, and of course, the system may shape us and mold us into that, right? Even if we are a very well intentioned educator, like there's so many things that we need to deliver and things get lost. But also, I don't know if it's kind of getting in our heads like being a teacher and what does that mean? And should that mean I should be the one with all the answers for the students, right? But can we just actually let go a little bit and let
Yeah,
them um, but yeah, I'm curious to
yeah,
see because there's a lot of top-down problems, and I'm curious to see what these years of habits we
yeah.
developed as teachers and educators, if that's also getting in our head. So if there's like both like
Yeah.
bottom up and top down problems in that sense.
It is. It's complicated, right? Like you touched on several things there. So education is primarily something that happens to us, right? And we have very little say in our voices are not included in that at most levels, right? I mean, once you go to get your PhD, then you get to pick your you know the question that you're really curious about and stress over it for the next 4 years or whatever, right? But for much of education is something that happens to us. I mean, you mentioned Montessori, and you know, there's the early progressives that realize like that's crazy. Your voice is valuable, and part of it comes back to the skills that really matter, help you to develop your voice and a sense of agency. Part of it comes back to this notion that we all learn differently, and you need to be attentive to the young people that you're serving. And so, and in spite of that, or not in spite of it, and in spite of the system, there's many amazing educators that work to try to figure out how to do that. The system is not set up to really be human centered.
Yeah.
It's not a human centered design. It is a top down, like, hey, we've got this and we're going to deliver it. And uh, and human beings are amazing, right? And so, you know, you make connections and you kind of work in and around and through that system. And it is a huge problem. Teacher education is a huge problem, right? If the system's broken and you go in and you're being trained to be the deliverer of information, or you know, in some cases the savior, you're riding in on your white horse, which is even worse. Um, uh, it's the wrong mindset, and it's the wrong set of trainings. And so there needs to be change everywhere. And the it's a challenging question, like what is the
Yeah.
drivers to help create those changes. And I think there's a lot of things, and that's when I come back to like assessment is one of those big levers that we could pull on. That would, if you're being held accountable for how did you include children's voice,
Yeah.
if you're being held accountable for what are the diversity of learning experiences that you're providing, how are you partnering with the community, like now as a school, I'm like, oh, I'm not being held accountable for how many kids passed the algebra 2 stupid exam. I have to actually put some time and energy into these things. You know, it can be one of the forcing functions that helps to drive some innovation. But it's, you know, it's not quick. um,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's definitely a complicated question.
But it's very, I mean, it's a great point on like both assessment of the students, assessment of teachers, assessment of schools. Like in bottom line, like what expectations are being set so people can act accordingly, right? And I think there's a lot of analogous like examples here where if we had changed how we assess our health, we could move away from symptom treatments to
Yes.
holistic, healthcare. Or
Yeah.
if we moved away from even how we're assessing companies to how to invest in them, then we could then, companies that are rich today could be very purposeful companies. Or even how we
Right.
look at profit, right? Is it just monetary, or can we actually look at assess profit in a different way for a company, and that
Right.
drives, stock values? And I think there's a need for us to, like, given the world that we live in today and where we're going to, like, real urgency almost in kind of like changing our mindset of like, just because we were assessing something as this 100 years ago doesn't mean it's the right thing today. And also
Right.
really recognizing that like adaptability, flexibility is an urgent need. It's almost like a survival mechanism in the world that we live in today. Like we can't necessarily afford to like set up a system and just rely on that heavily for 50 years. I
Right.
don't even know if we're going to be around for the next 50 years, but
Yeah.
we just really need to find, like, look into ways like how we might bring that agility and also how we just evaluate things all together.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
with with that, I would love to just like to really give an example of what an ideal education could look like. And we talked about the assessment, but I don't know if you want to give a like specific example from like a semester project at workshop school, and so showing that how could a diverse alternative look like.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're if again, if we had a magic wand and unlimited resources, the workshop school would probably look slightly different. We live within a system, and so there's compromises that we make all the time. Um, and we're super proud of the model that we've created. It's a balance between really rich, authentic learning, given the resources that we have, and we still live in a system that requires GPAs and state testing, and we want to make sure that our young people have access to post-secondary education, right? Um, and so it's a bit of a balancing act. So what we've done is we basically split the school day in half, and in the morning, students work on interdisciplinary projects in a tight community that we call advisory. So there's one adult, 20 students ish. Um, and there's very purposeful, continuous community building so that you feel connected and valued, and that your voice is heard, and that you have a say in the community that you're a part of. Um, and in that community, you're always working on two projects at any given time. And these are heavily interdisciplinary, and some will be more hands-on, and some will be more kind of research based. So in terms of examples of what this can look like, so we have advisory. Students are working on two projects that are interdisciplinary. Sometimes they're hands-on. Often people think like we're always building stuff at workshop school, which is not true. And yes, students do hands-on projects. But for example, in 10th grade right now, students are doing a boat project. So they're learning about buoyancy and some basic scientific principles around that. They're learning to collaborate. They're working on a team. They're learning some design principles. Um, and ultimately, through a prototyping process, they make a cardboard boat that can carry a human being. And we take them to the YMCA and they race them. And part of it is fun and community building as well. And then they reflect on how their prototype and what they learned about design influence their final results, and kind of reflect on that. Um, the other project that they're doing is a digital memoir. And so looking at an event in their life that has shaped who they are and why that event is important to them. And so it's a lot of reflection and writing. What does it mean to what are memoirs? Um, and and then the actual recording process is a real learning experience for them as well. How do you put together a compelling story in 5 minutes or less? Um, and take your writing and translate it into a digital format that's engaging and compelling. Um, Students will do a project that's 10th grade. 10th grade students will do another project on mass incarceration this year and look at the history of incarceration in this country and what does it mean, in particular for the communities that they live in. And pre-COVID, students would then organize a big symposium on mass incarceration. And it would be very well attended from schools and officials around the city. To share their learning and to host conversations around what can we do to address some of these underlying issues that continue to lead to this problem. And so, yeah, projects can look like all sorts of things. When there's a product that is authentic or somewhat authentic, like a cardboard boat at the end that you can put out into the world and kind of test or push on a little bit. We feel like that there's all these connected learning experiences. I mean, you're communicating to outside audiences, you're building networks that are super valuable. In the afternoon, students are taking classes that are organized around content, and while they're more creative than like our math class is more creative than a traditional Algebra 1 class, your students still need to learn fundamental math skills, and be prepared to take standardized tests. And so figuring out what's the most important content and how to teach that in a directive but also more authentic way is one of the things that we do. So they have English, they have math, they have shop, and then there's other things that kind of rotate through there depending on the grade level.
I mean, I love it so much, and I genuinely believe, especially like given the changes happening in our world, but also like the things we're really stuck on, you really need a mixed methods approach. I feel like it's really hard to, I mean, a lot of the progressive schools also that are only like in one way is having a hard time to grow, right? They generally don't go beyond first grade or even second grade. So in that sense, I think having such an approach is so important because I do believe eventually colleges will come to a state. I don't know when this happens, but they won't. Instead of looking at scores, they will look at portfolios. I mean, they
Yeah.
have to, right? Like, I would imagine 100 years from now, when like, half of maybe East Coast is underwater, building a boat will be a very relevant skill set.
No,
We
and
didn't know
I
what to
think
do. We would come to you.
exactly. And I think you've touched on a really important point. I mean, COVID and the pandemic has been horrible. And one of the things that's come out of it is the need for higher education to reform, to accelerate. Like, there's, I think of it this way. This is not a perfect analogy, but many higher education institutions understand that Amazon is coming. We don't know what that is, right? Like the
Yeah.
higher ed world is changing. If you told us 20 years ago there's going to be an Amazon where 90% of us are going to do 80% of our shopping there, we would have thought you were crazy.
Yeah.
But there's seismic shifts happening on higher ed. And many of the colleges know that they're Kmart. They're going to be out of business if they don't change, right? And you'll always have your boutique shops, like your Ivy League schools are not going to go away. Your top end design schools, they're not going to go away, right? There'll always be, I don't know. I'm not a Gap, maybe no, more than Gap. What's better than Gap? Free
I know, like
People.
a high-end brand.
Yeah, yeah. Urban Outfitters isn't going away, right? Gucci, is Gucci still a
Yeah.
thing? Gucci's not going away probably. So those will exist no matter what this new landscape looks like.
Yeah.
But it's shifting. Like the number of institutions that are dropping degree requirements because, surprise, surprise, college does a lot of the same thing high school does and doesn't help people to really tap into what their interests are
Yeah.
and develop really, really portable skills around creativity and problem solving. Like, you know, problems in life are not textbook. You're not given all these inputs and having one variable to solve for it. Like, you know, um, how do you communicate? So employers are reporting more dissatisfaction with college graduates not being ready for the workforce. And yes, there is specific knowledge. Like you want engineers to know calculus. You want designers to know a design process, right?
Yeah.
You want doctors to know a set of knowledge, absolutely. And there's another set of knowledge that we have developed, usually kind of parallel to school or sometimes in spite of school, that have made us successful. And there's a movement, there is an early movement to start to think about how do you make that part of the learning experience. And what does that look like? And so some colleges are going to adapt and really think about, you see it in the technology field. You don't need a degree in computer science. You can create a portfolio, right? Like if you know how to code and you can demonstrate that, they don't care if you passed ancient European history. Like that doesn't have anything to do with your ability to code. So there's some fields that have already or have been adapting and will continue to adapt, and that are kind of ahead because it's very competency based is what I was trying to get to. There's other fields that competency based work it's a little bit still, folks are trying to figure out what those competencies are. But in my opinion, higher ed will be forced to change, and then high schools will be forced to change because there'll be a different landscape.
Yeah.
But it's a slow process, but we're seeing that happen, and COVID definitely has accelerated that.
Yeah. I hope it's interesting because I think, I mean, and we talked about Ivy Leagues, like it's kind of they are the ones that have all the funding to be able to do the change. And at the same time, they know people are going to come to them because of the name. So there's like reluctance to change.
Yeah,
And in that sense, too, like they kind of also need to set the model for maybe all of their universities, too, because maybe if this change starts from, I don't know, not so famous like universities? Is it gonna become as popular? Maybe it will. I have no idea how that would go. But I mean, even because I had, and I won't give a name just so that we don't embarrass anybody here, but I got into a PhD program at an Ivy League when I was 20. I shouldn't have done that. That's a whole other story. But, I was told I don't know what I should be taking, and I should be taking all the classes they're telling me to take for the first 2 years, and I should be an RA for professors who would need my help, and my voice was not heard. And I felt like it was that because they are this Ivy League and everybody wants to be there and they're giving you a scholarship, so they're doing you a favor, so you need to serve them. So it was about like zero of my interest and what I want to research in, and it did not matter. And I had the privilege to quit. I quit, right? Like I didn't care. I'm like, I don't necessarily need this. I didn't want a PhD in the first place. Like my entire family is academic, but I don't want to be, so I want to do my own thing. But so many people don't have that privilege, right? And then going to your point earlier, and how does an adult flourish, right? Like we're having a problem with like helping figuring that out at a younger age, and this problem permeates even like continues in higher ed, like even graduate school, even
yep,
at the
yep.
top schools,
Mhm.
because of, I don't know, our reluctance to change, our
Yeah.
egos, our, I don't know, so many things, right?
Well, it's a super powerful story that you just told. I mean, the place where that if you can get into an Ivy League, you usually have what we call, you have $100,000 in beer money. You're going to be okay, right? Like you're
Yeah.
going to come out on the other end of that experience. I have another friend that went to a very elite school, got a degree in something that he hated, and it took him for a few years. And now he's in the design field too, and he found his passion, and and he was okay because the inputs that he was receiving, even though he was miserable, is that when you graduated from this Ivy League, you're successful, you'll figure it out.
Mm.
And there's 39 million Americans that have some college and no degree. And so what does that mean? They have debt, they have self-doubt. The American dream is go to college and you'll be successful. It didn't work for them, and so now it's granted, I'm sure there's millions of those folks that recover and do fine. The population I serve primarily, that's the outliers that recover and do fine. The majority of middle and lower middle class folks that dream doesn't initially work for, it's actually has a negative return on investment. You just changed your direct trajectory in a negative way, right? Versus if they had worked for a couple of years and figured out what they're interested in, or went to a program that said, look, we're going to help you figure out what your skills and interests and passions are, and we're going to give you a handful of skills. How do you network? How do you uh, build a network and exercise it? How do you collaborate? How do you problem solve? How do you develop a sense of agency so that you can act on some next steps, right? And so anyway, I think that higher ed will shift. I think that you touched on a really important point. One of the things that slowed it down is that um, people that have agency or ability to move through it, even though it doesn't work for them, still come out on the other side okay,
Yeah.
right? And
So they get away with it. I mean, the
they get
school.
away with it, and
Yeah.
and that goes into like what does American poverty mean, which is, I don't think there's enough podcasts in the world to unpack that one.
Yeah.
but but the reality is that for far, I mean, 39 one we've done some research into this recently. Like 39 million Americans have some college, no degree debt. And what's implied there is they have self-doubt. And a lot of them do. And have the American dream doesn't make sense to them. So anyway, uh, something has to change.
Yeah. And to me now, like, I mean, I wish, all schools could be like workshop school, right? And even like, in different fields, like if it's an art school, it should still look like that, right? Like, how do
Right,
you create things together and work on projects together, understand
right.
collaboration, and also by working in like something that also could be just happening in like real life, even if you don't understand what you want to do in life, maybe you understand what you don't want to do, right? Like going through processes, like
Absolutely.
understanding where you're good at and skill sets, and that's already a huge asset for a young individual.
Huge. That's huge. Yeah.
So how do you scale? How can all schools become workshop school? To me,
Yeah,
that's
and I'm not even sure they all need to be workshop school, but I think on this back end is this idea of assessment, and as the demands of the workforce are changing college, and as college has to respond, you'll have slow change there. I think on the other end is this idea that we're obsessed with quantity of skills instead of like
Hmm.
focus on a handful of skills and then let people practice, play with, use them in authentic ways, right? And so um, I don't know, pick any analogy, a sports analogy, a car analogy. You're not going to teach a mechanic the hundreds of tools. You're going to teach them to use the handful of fundamental tools and then go use them. Use them by themselves, use them with people. Here's a car, let's figure out how to fix it with this set of tools, right? Sports analogy, same thing. I mean, art, I'm sure again, I'm very limited in my art ability, but it has to hold, right? Like, here's a handful of tools, go play with those tools, use them instead of let's show you how to use a whole bunch of tools and then you don't ever get a chance to use them,
Yeah.
right? um it's like watching people run drills in soccer and then you never play a game. um and that would even be an improvement. Like
Yeah.
in schools, we're watching videos of people running drills in soccer, and then we take a quiz on the drill on soccer. But there's like, all right, go run some drills in soccer, and then play a game with it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so and there's so much good peripheral learning that occurs when you're putting things into action, individually and together, that that are in of themselves invaluable, but also, in my opinion, just make that learning go much deeper. Now I know what a wrench does, and I can do all these things with a
Right.
wrench, and I've become really good with a wrench. And
Right.
now I'm ready for the next tool, right? Or I've come up against the limit of what a wrench can do, and I need a new tool. Wow. Uh, so anyway, that's
I mean, I love that because like all that information dump and like just learning what tools are out there, like now you can do that on YouTube, right? Like through Google. Like we don't need schools for it to like do the information dump for us. We probably
yes,
can find out even more on Google. So like schools turning into these like hubs of activation almost. Like how does this come
yes,
to life? I
yes,
think that ultimately really how we need to change, even for the physical space to make sense,
yeah,
right? Like, why
yes,
are we congregating in this physical space together? Like, even offices are now changing into, okay, if we're coming to office only twice a week, then maybe this should be more like collaborative setup, right? Like the
yep,
design should be like that, or it should be more strategy meetings should be
yeah,
happening here. But if you need to work on admin stuff, you can be at home. So I think in that sense, we need to really like shift the way we even see what the school is for. Like, what is it
yeah.
giving us? It doesn't necessarily, I mean, of course, getting information from teachers probably would be more valid than a random link on Google, but still, I think the biggest benefit is like, how does this come to life and to practice, and how does it connect to our lives?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful term. I'm going to steal it from you, and I'll try
Please.
to remember to give you credit. But the schools should be hubs of activation. I agree, and how the delivery of that information occurs. outside of that space, or maybe in conjunction with that space, you could have lots of creative ways. I mean, you could have uh, uh, somebody who just does their own research, but you could also have software or teachers or and then, the other point that's connected to that, and we see this at workshop school, that's really important, is that there is some human connection, as you said earlier, that that there is value of having adults that have experience, be a mentor, be a coach, right? When I think,
Yeah.
when most of us think over our lives, we've had a mentor or coach that sees stuff in us that we can't see and pushes us to do things that we wouldn't necessarily do without their input. And so that role of adult teacher, mentor, coach is critical, I think.
Yeah. Maybe if we change all our titles to mentors, our approach to how we work could also change.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good point. So,
Well, I mean, Simon, this is amazing, and I know we can talk forever on this, but I do want to be mindful of your time. So I do want to ask, what would be your advice to anyone who wants to make progress or act a little bit differently in any field that they're going into?
I think that yeah, my bit of advice would be that no matter where you are in that learning journey, is to really pause and think about the experiences, the people in your life that can help you get in touch with the things that you're passionate about. What are your skills? What are your passions, interests? Uh, and to know that's valuable. Like, some of us are dancers and some of us are doctors. One's not more important than the other, even though society might say so. And and then I think starting with that allows us to really pursue a life that's true to ourselves. And and there's a lot of external pressures, family pressures, societal pressures, and whatever pressures of wanting to be felt as you're valuable, and living up to some set of expectations. And I think in the long run, um, figuring that set of things out, like what really makes you you and what do you want to do next, is a key driver. We don't need a There's an obsession with a 5 or 10 year plan. I don't know what I want to do in 10 years, right? Like, that's crazy. Like, but I do know what I want to do next. And I know that it's true to myself. And so how do I act on that?
Love that. Well, Simon, thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
We're definitely going to continue to follow everything about workshop school for sure. And we really hope the approach you have in the school really just echoes into the country and beyond, really, to really be that bottom up driver of like change, right? Like,
Yeah.
because it's a beautiful example of how you don't necessarily wait to system to change, because who knows how long that's going to take. So we thank you for your hard work and setting such
Thank
an
you.
example, and look forward to seeing what else you guys will come up with.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time to talk to me. It's great chatting.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.